Yeah, brother Yusuf, one thing here in the West, especially living in the UK, unfortunately, the people, the mass population, seem to understand that this conflict started on the 7th of October.
Mm.
But with your studies and your research, when did this conflict actually start, and how did it come to pass? Or how did it initially trigger the whole, situation that we are currently right now in?
Yeah, thanks, Brother Mohammed and Brother Mustafa. I think that's a kind of a talking point, and for the first time, I never watched these shows, but they've become so popular. Piers Morgan Uncensored. We never watched him before the 7th of October. Talk TV. I've now discovered that Talk TV is owned by News Corp, which is controlled by Rupert Murdoch, and that seems to be the constant talking point about 7th of October. Do you condemn Hamas? What's your take? So it basically, in a sense, it puts you in the automatic position of defense. And even some of the Muslim brothers out there who come out and in fact condemn Hamas. I understand that Hamas is proscribed in the United Kingdom as a supposed terrorist organization. The hypocrisy of the entire situation, in light of the fact that your government, the UK government, has been responsible for some of the worst atrocities, I mean, in the world. I think your own politician, George Galloway, once, when questioned, pointed out that your government under Blair killed 1 million people in Iraq. So it's a height of cynicism that this nation prescribes another organization as a terrorist organization, notwithstanding the fact that in the 80s, it also designated the ANC and Nelson Mandela under the Thatcherite regime as terrorist outfits. So this is basically the sense of the duplicity, the double standards, and the hypocrisy. And unfortunately, when we fall into the trap of believing that history began on the 7th of October, or we buy directly into the narrative of condemnation, we automatically basically put ourselves in the back foot. So, coming to the root of the question, where did this begin? Where did this start? And I think Brother Mustafa and yourself, from what you've informed me, have gone into detail with this. But the actual, Zionist movement, at least, and I'm kind of ridding it of its so-called religious undertones, but the actual modern Zionist movement was founded or formed by one individual, Theodor Herzl, who was by no means a religiously minded Jew. He was secular, and he wrote a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. I think it was sometime in the 1890s. And the whole aim of that was to envision the founding of a future independent Jewish state during the 20th century. That was the entire thrust of it. The thrust was basically, let's create this homeland for Jewish people in Palestine or wherever the area is. And, it essentially emerged, I may add, as a result of the rising forms of anti-Semitism. And I'm saying anti-Semitism in a particular context because we're talking about European hatred towards other white Jew people who were designating or calling themselves Jews, because these were white people, these were white European individuals, and they were subjected to persecution based, of course, on their purported affiliation towards Judaism or something that was basically viewed as strange. And so from the 1890s right up going to the 1940s, the whole aim or the goal of the Zionist movement was to basically establish homeland. Now, I may add, and I read this somewhere, I think it's in this book, which I would highly recommend to your viewers to get, a fantastic book by Sami Hadawi, who was basically a Palestinian scholar who lived in Jerusalem in 1904, and he worked as an official land valuer during the British Mandate in the period of Palestine. He made the point that initially when Zionism or when the Zionist movement were calling for the establishment of a Jewish homeland, they had different places in mind. They, for example, and I was quite surprised to note that they had a country called Uganda in Africa as a possible potential Jewish homeland. They had a certain aspects, in Argentina. This was obviously before the Balkanization process, so you didn't have kind of nation states that had been essentially formed. And so these were alternatives that they were looking at. They were looking at Latin America, South America, parts of Africa. And so it was not a kind of a foregone conclusion that the land Palestine, or what was then basically under the Ottoman control, was going to be eventually what basically became Israel, although that would have been the likely outcome or the determination by these individuals. But they looked at various alternatives. And so eventually, through a series of recommendations made by them, a large number of Jewish people, they immigrated first to the Ottoman region, which was then under Ottoman control, and later, after the First World War, under what then became known as the Mandatory Palestine, or the Palestinian Mandate, which was then under a colonial occupation. And subsequently, you basically find a situation that after Israel was bombed into existence, and I must put this point here, bombed into existence, it continued primarily to advocate on behalf of Israel, that Zionism as an ideology continues to advocate on behalf of Israel and to obviously address the threats to its continued so-called existence and its so-called right to self-defense, which you're hearing all the time. Now, may I add this point that when the partition took place, and you will probably know, the land that was apportioned to what was going to become Jewish land was, I think, something like 57%, and the Palestinian control partition was about 42%. But and so the argument that is generally put forth out there is that, well, Palestinians never accepted this. But the reality of the situation is that when Israel was eventually bombed into existence, it basically took something like 70%, 75% of the particular land. So it took more of the land than what was initially apportioned to it. The other argument, and we may, probably go into this in detail, hopefully the conversation goes forth, is that the argument that is presented out there that basically Israel was a kind of a benign entity. These were benign Jewish communities. And suddenly you had a situation where Arabs and the Arab armies invaded and attacked them. Nothing could be further from the truth, because leading up to the existence of the state of Israel, which was bombed into existence, you had a series of massacres and terrorist attacks by Jewish terrorist outfits, which were euphemistically described as Jewish militia outfits. And you know the names like Irgun and Stern, which were subcategories of the Haganah. And they were involved in some of the most horrendous, vicious, brutal massacres that you could ever believe in. I mean, you look at, you can't even, we don't even have the time to go into the list of the massacres that basically took place. But there were, for example, the famous massacre that people normally talk about, the Deir Yassin massacre, where you have a situation that Palestinian women were systematically gang raped by Jewish terrorist outfits. They were gang raped. You had, for example, a situation in terms of which they raped the women, they lined up the men, and they shot them dead in cold blood. And some of the individuals that were leading these outfits were individuals that became the founding fathers of Israel, like Menachem Begin and David Ben-Gurion. It's quite ironical that, when Rishi Sunak, when he went, I think, to Israel, just I think a couple of months back, and we saw, I don't know if you probably saw on the press or whether it was in fact shown in London, but we saw the images about him coming out of an aircraft and in fact giving the Israeli ambassador to the UK with arms and ammunition. We saw this out there at the height of the genocide that was basically taking place. He in fact stayed, and I believe he stayed not too far away from the King David Hotel, which was subjected to bombing and destruction by these Israeli terrorist death squads, where I think you had, for example, British soldiers, British military outfits that were massacred. And there's been no apology to date, And it's quite ironical that when the Prime Minister went there and staying not too far, I believe nearby the King David Hotel, that there's not a qualm, not a whimper made about what had happened. So the reality of the situation that the formation of the state of Israel was bloody. This was from the early 1940s, at least 1945, right up till 1947, when it was bombed into existence. And even before that, in the 30s, you had these sporadic killings that were being conducted by these Jewish terrorist squads, which people should know and which people should acknowledge and which people should realize which laid the basis for the foundation of any hostility that may have existed, that was basically that may have manifested by the Arab regimes that were around that particular area. So basically what had happened in 1948, then Israel was bombed into existence. They created a massive refugee crisis. We know close to 1 million Palestinians were left, and they became essentially refugees, and they were never allowed to remain in that particular area. Those Palestinians that eventually stayed there, David Ben-Gurion, I think, made a statement that at a much later time in history that he wished he could have got rid of them as well. And then subsequently, what had happened after 1948, you had the Gaza Strip, which was under Egyptian control, and then you had the West Bank, which was under Jordanian control. But come 1967, Israel then invaded those particular territories, and subsequently, up until the 80s, that's 88, Gaza was basically still under occupation. In 1990, you had the Oslo Accords, and eventually you had the so-called removal of these particular Israeli armed officials in 2005, where the settlers were removed, where there were, I may add, just simply a superficial legislative election, because Hamas was not in control of anything, but the people basically voted for Hamas in light of the corruption that was existing in the Palestinian Authority, and people believed that the Palestinian Authority had sold out. And after Hamas had gone into legislative control, what then happened was that you had a total blockade, which totally devastated the Gaza economy and caused about approximately 50% of the poverty rate and probably one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Now, we make this point before I end this particular portion, that there were these rocket attacks. I may point this out, that these rockets that were so-called flying into Israel from Hamas have no airheads. They've caused absolutely, I think, from 2006 to 2023, that's up until the 7th of October, up to, I think, about 39 casualties. And I may add that the rockets were only fired by Hamas after there was a raid by Israel in 2006 in the Gaza Strip, after Hamas had won the legislative election, and after there was an airstrike. And so then you had these rocket attacks which were fired by Hamas, and then it subsequently led to Operation Castle in 2009, and of course Operation Pill of Defense, I think, in 2014. So in 2009, 2012, 2014, and now of course 2019. And then you had the situation in the Sheikh Jarrah area, I think in 2021, where Israeli settlers stormed and they removed Palestinians from this particular area. But the problem is, what has happened is that since 2006, right up until this particular point in time, Gaza has been under siege. And I've seen some of the comments which are being made in some of the British media, like Talk TV and I think Sky News Australia, for that particular matter, that Gaza could be a potential Singapore. What absolute hogwash! What rubbish! I mean, look at the situation in Gaza. Prior to the 7th of October, 96% of the water was undrinkable. Gazans in general had about 4 to 5 hours of electricity per day. They had 45% unemployment. You had 46% of the kids that suffer anemia. 50% of the children had depression, and 2 million of the people who were denied the actual freedom to live. So when you have a situation that they claim that this could be potentially Singapore, What the reality of the situation was that Israel supplied and they stopped and they started, but they controlled the supply of water, electricity, fuel, um, and in relation to the ports itself, that's not under control of Gazans at all. So if you contrast that to, for example, a nation like Singapore, with an extremely highly developed market economy, most of the GDP that has been generated or coming out of the of Singapore is basically historically based on the extended trade at the ports, what they call the entreport trade. So, along with Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, the so-called four Asian tigers, the gross domestic product since 1965 right up until now has averaged up. There's been growth rates averaging approximately 6% per annum. So it's absolute nonsense when you say that, look, we've left Gaza on its own. So Gaza, we are now living under perpetual threat. Instead of basically developing the economy, Hamas has basically engaged in building up these particular tunnels. The reality of the situation is Hamas is not, was not, and has never ever been for the past decade and a half an existential threat to Israel. Not at all. It has never been, with the exception of what happened on the 7th of October. And we'll, of course, explore the dynamics about what really happened. But Hamas has never been a threat whatsoever to Israel. The reality of the situation, I mean, even the items of the goods, there's a policy which Israel has that it measures the number of people in Gaza, and it basically mentions, or it basically suggests that Gaza has to be a portion that each individual has to be given a certain number of calories per day, which is beyond the basic minimum calories that you could have. So therefore, not surprisingly, a lot of commentators have described this as a mass open prison. But in reality, it's not a mass open prison, because in a prison, you basically have food, you have water, you have the basic decent sanitation. These Gazans don't even have basic decent sanitation when 90% of the water is undrinkable. So how on earth could you call it a prison in the first place? It's an open concentration camp. A prison is not bombed. A prison is not sporadically having a situation where Israeli soldiers run in and rush in and perpetually go and shoot people randomly or engage in raids. The control is purely superficial from the perspective of Hamas, and therefore, not surprisingly, what you've got, or what happened on the 7th of October, is simply symptomatic of a far larger problem, which quite conveniently the mainstream media is hiding and, of course, not basically showing. But I'm optimistic because for the first time ever, I see, which you've never seen in the past and you could never see 20 years ago, where outfits like, for example, Sky News and BBC and CNN are asking questions that they would not ordinarily have asked. I mean, I see there was an interview which was conducted, I believe, on Sky News by one of your journalists, where he was questioning Mark Regeb, or it was the other nutcase, Elon Levi, on the issue of the shooting of the massacre at the Maghazi camp that just took place on Christmas Eve. And I saw the questions that were asked, which was surprising to me, because in the past, mainstream journalists in the United Kingdom and in the US would never ask these particular questions, albeit they are somewhat subdued. But the point is, these questions are now being asked. And I believe at some level, Israel is in fact losing the propaganda war. Social media and certainly podcasts like you brothers and others out there are changing the game. You're changing what's happening, and the lies that we've been subjected to for a number of years, for decades rather, that's slowly being waved away, it's been eked away. And so people are basically seeing that we are no longer being subjected to the kind of propagandas and lies. And we've got a new generation. The younger generation have access to social media. They've got access to TikTok in real time. And of course, you see these images before your eyes. You see images of beheaded babies, but they're not Israeli babies, they're Palestinian babies. You see images of burnt children and burnt people. but they're not burned children or burned people from the 7th of October. They are burned Palestinians in real time before our eyes. So it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult for Israel or its propagandists out there to, in fact, construct an argument. And so it's just a kind of a threefold argument that they invent. They either say, number one, that they've got no choice for the deaths because these people are human shields, albeit the Palestinians, which is a racist analogy, that they are human shields. Or number two, that what basically happened was essentially a mistake, as they claimed in the Maghazi camp, the refugee camp last week, where they claimed that the incorrect munitions were used. Well, what munitions were used, for example, at the Jabalia refugee camp, when close to 100 people were killed to target one Hamas person? Was it not a mistake then? Or alternatively, the third alternative is that they're saying that they are acting under self-defense. So the lies and the propagandist hogwash is falling away before our eyes. And nobody takes us seriously anymore. No decent person with common sense can basically take this seriously. And I think we need to be far more emboldened. I do understand that there are limitations and restrictions on the brothers in terms of movements like Hamas, but in South Africa, we basically, our South African government met with Hamas. We met with Hamas leadership just a couple of weeks back. So I understand that there's a dilemma in terms of what people can say or cannot say in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom. But at the very least, we need to conscientize people in terms of breaking the shackles of the propaganda that has been enclosing their eyes for a number of years. And I think I can see that is happening slowly, albeit at a slow pace, but it's happening. And people are no longer buying into this kind of propagandist lie and racist stereotypes that are before our eyes.